The night Richard Pemberton, the Duke of Asheville, walked into the ivory room, he believed he was there to save himself. He was wrong. He was there to be destroyed, slowly, deliberately, and with the kind of precision that only comes from years of patient, careful hatred. The woman behind the black mask had been waiting for this night longer than he could imagine. She had studied every card game he had ever played. She knew which risks he took when he was desperate. She knew the exact moment his confidence would crack and his hands would tremble. She knew because she had once known everything about him. And he, the man who had thrown her away like a torn letter, did not even recognize her eyes. To the outside world, Richard Pemberton was everything a duke was supposed to be. He was tall, composed, and impeccably dressed at every occasion. His estate in Wiltshire was one of the finest in England. His family name carried 300 years of history, and when he entered a room, people noticed. They always noticed. What they did not notice, what Richard had spent years making certain no one would notice, was that the Pemberton fortune was rotting from the inside. It had started with his father. The old Duke had been a generous man, which was a polite way of saying he had spent money he did not have on things he did not need. Race horses, failed investments, a grand renovation of the East Wing that had taken 4 years and solved nothing. By the time Richard inherited the title at 26, the debts were staggering. Not impossible, but staggering. For 3 years Richard had managed. He had cut expenses quietly, sold 2 smaller properties without announcement, and kept up every appearance that mattered. No one in society suspected a thing, but managing was not solving, and Richard was running out of time. His advisor, Lord Edmund Harwick, had made that very clear. Harwick was not a titled man himself, but he was the kind of person that titled men could not afford to ignore. He had advised Richard's father before him, and he had a gift for knowing exactly how much trouble a person was in before that person knew it themselves. "You have perhaps 8 months," Harwick had told Richard one gray Tuesday morning, sitting across from him in the study with a cup of tea he had not touched. "Perhaps less, if the Wiltshire rents come in short again this quarter." Richard had said nothing. He had looked out the window at the grounds that had belonged to his family for generations and felt something cold settle in his chest. "There is a solution," Harwick continued. "There is always a solution for men in your position. The solution, of course, was marriage. Not just any marriage, a strategic one, a wealthy one. The kind of arrangement that had kept noble families afloat for centuries, where love was never mentioned and comfort was considered a reasonable substitute. Harwick had already identified the candidate. Lady Sophia Grenville was 23 years old, the only daughter of a viscount who had made a second fortune in railway investment. She was handsome in a cold, angular way, well-mannered, and entirely without warmth. Every conversation Richard had ever had with her felt like a business negotiation conducted in a drawing room, but her dowry would solve everything. Richard had agreed. He had not been happy about it, but he had agreed because that was what men in his position did. They made the sensible choice. They buried the inconvenient feelings and they made the sensible choice. He had done it before, after all. 3 years ago, he had been engaged to someone else entirely. He did not let himself think about that often. When he did, he moved the thought aside quickly, the way one moves an object that is too hot to hold. It did not do to dwell. He had made a decision. It had been the right decision. Harwick had said so. His mother had said so. He had written the letter himself. He had ended it. He did not think about Vivienne Castellan. He had made himself stop. The engagement to Lady Sophia was announced quietly in October. The wedding was set for late December, 6 weeks away. Richard told himself he felt relief. He told himself that every morning when he woke up, and most evenings before he went to sleep, and occasionally in the middle of the afternoon when he found himself sitting at his desk staring at nothing. It was on one of those hollow October evenings that Harwick came to see him again. "There is a matter I would like to discuss," Harwick said, setting his hat on the side table with the careful precision of a man who was about to say something he had rehearsed. "A financial opportunity, discreet, efficient." Richard looked at him. "I am getting married in 6 weeks, Harwick. I am not certain this is the moment for opportunities." "The wedding will solve the long-term situation," Harwick said smoothly. "But there are certain short-term debts, immediate debts, that require attention before December. It would not do for certain creditors to make their impatience known publicly, not during the engagement period." Richard felt the cold thing in his chest again. "What are you suggesting?" Harwick smiled. It was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "There is a club," he said, "very private, very exclusive. The right game played correctly on the right night, a man can settle a great deal in a single evening." Richard should have said no. He knew it the moment the words left Harwick's mouth. He knew it the way one knows a step is rotten before the foot comes down, a half-second of instinct that arrives just slightly too late. But he thought about the creditors. He thought about the wedding. He thought about 6 weeks and a cold woman and a life built on a sensible choice. "Tell me about the club," he said. The Ivory Room was not the kind of place that appeared on any map of London. It existed in a narrow building off St. James's Street, behind a door with no sign, accessible only to those who had been personally invited by a current member. The rooms inside were hushed and impeccably appointed, dark wood paneling, green baize tables, candlelight that was always flattering and never quite bright enough to see anyone too clearly. That, Richard would later understand, was entirely intentional. He arrived on a Thursday evening in late October with Harwick at his side, was greeted by a man who knew his name without being told it, and was shown to a table near the far wall where 3 other gentlemen were already seated. He played for 2 hours that first night. He won modestly, he lost modestly. He went home neither richer nor poorer and told himself it had been a pointless exercise. But Harwick had been right about one thing. There was an opportunity in that room. Richard had felt it. He went back the following Thursday. It was on that second visit that he first saw her. She was seated at a corner table, alone, with a glass of wine she had barely touched and a stillness about her that made her somehow more visible than the men moving around the room. She wore black from collar to hem, not mourning black, but deliberate black, chosen black, and a mask that covered the upper half of her face in smooth, dark silk. Her hands were gloved. Her posture was perfect. The man beside Richard leaned over and murmured, "That is the widow. She comes every Thursday. No one knows her name. No one has beaten her." Richard looked at her for a moment longer than was polite. She did not look back, or if she did, he could not tell. He told himself he was simply curious. He told himself that too. The third Thursday, Richard did not wait. He crossed the room before Harwick could steer him elsewhere, pulled out the chair across from the widow, and sat down. She did not look up immediately. She was arranging her chips with a quiet, unhurried precision, as though she had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. When she finally raised her eyes to his, Richard felt something he had not expected. Not attraction, not curiosity, recognition. Not of her face, the mask made that impossible. It was something else. Something in the angle of her head, the particular stillness of her hands, the way she looked at him without any of the usual performance women employed when a duke sat down across from them. She simply looked at him, as though she already knew exactly what she was going to find. "I have been told no one beats you," Richard said. "You have been told correctly," she said. Her voice was low and even. She had the kind of diction that suggested excellent education, careful upbringing, and a complete absence of any desire to impress him. Then I suppose I should warn you, Richard said, settling back in his chair with the easy confidence that 3 generations of dukes had bred into his posture. I intend to be the exception. The widow looked at him for one long moment. Then she reached forward, cut the deck, and said, "Deal." She let him win the first hand. He did not know that, of course. That was the point. The cards fell his way with just enough natural imperfection to feel entirely real. A near miss on her part here. A fortunate turn for him there. Richard felt the familiar sharpening that came with a good game, that particular clarity where everything outside the table ceased to exist. He had always loved cards, not for the money or not only for the money, for the thinking, the reading of another person across a table, the small tells and deliberate misdirections, the conversation that happened entirely without words. He was good at it. He had always been told he was good at it. The widow was better. He could not see it yet. That was also the point. She lost the first hand gracefully, without any of the irritation or surprise that losing produced in most players. She simply noted the outcome, rearranged her remaining chips with that same quiet precision, and waited. "You take losing well," Richard observed. "I take everything well," she said. "It is one of the skills one develops." "One develops," he repeated. "That is an interesting way to phrase it, as though it were a lesson learned rather than a natural temperament." She looked at him across the table. "Most useful things are learned," she said. "Very few arrive naturally." Richard found he had nothing to say to that. He won the second hand as well. He lost the third. Not dramatically. Not in the devastating way that broke lesser men and sent them to the bar for something stronger than wine. It was a clean, almost elegant loss, the kind that left a player feeling that with one different decision, one different card, the outcome would have been entirely reversed, which was, of course, exactly how she intended it to feel. "There it is," Richard said, studying his cards for a moment after she laid down her hand. "There what is?" the widow asked. "The loss. I was beginning to wonder if you were simply going to let me win all evening." Something moved across her expression, too brief and too controlled to name. "Would that have satisfied you?" she asked. "Not in the least," Richard said. "No," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I did not think it would." He glanced up at her. She was already looking at the new deal being laid between them, her face composed and unreadable behind the mask. He had the strangest feeling that she had meant something more than the cards. He told himself he was imagining it. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The pattern established itself with a naturalness that Richard did not examine too closely, because examining it would have required him to admit certain things he was not prepared to admit. That the ivory room had stopped being about the money somewhere around the third visit. That Harwick's careful guidance toward the card tables had become, for Richard, entirely beside the point. The point was the corner table, the black dress, the still, gloved hands and the voice that gave nothing away. He won sometimes. He lost more often. Each game felt like a conversation conducted in a language he almost spoke. He could follow the shape of it, feel the rhythm, but there was always something just beyond his understanding. Some layer of meaning he could not quite reach. "You are not from London originally," he said one evening, with the confidence of a man who has been studying someone for weeks and believes he has found something. The widow considered her cards. "What makes you say so?" "The way you speak. Educated, certainly, but there is something in it, a precision that Londoners rarely bother with. London assumes everyone already knows what it means. You learn to make yourself understood." A pause, barely a second long. "That is very observant," she said, and her voice was entirely smooth. "For someone who is about to lose this hand." She was right, he lost. But he had rattled her. For just that fraction of a second, he had rattled her, and he did not know why that felt more significant than any card game he had ever won. It was Harwick who first said it out loud. "You are becoming distracted," he said, on a gray November morning in Richard's study, with the tone of a man delivering a diagnosis. The wedding is 5 weeks away. Lady Sophia's father has been asking questions, and you have been spending your Thursday evenings losing money to a woman no one can identify. I have also been winning money, Richard said, without looking up from his correspondence. Less than you are losing. The situation is manageable. Richard, Harwick's voice dropped into a register he rarely used, something quieter, more deliberate. I am telling you to be careful. Richard did look up then. Harwick was watching him with an expression that was difficult to interpret, not concern exactly, something more calculating than concern. She is a distraction, Harwick said, nothing more. Whatever you imagine is happening at that table, it is not what you think. Richard held his gaze for a moment. And what do I think? He asked. Harwick picked up his hat from the side table. That is what concerns me, he said, and left. Richard sat for a long time after Harwick had gone. He thought about Lady Sophia, who would arrive for dinner on Friday and speak to him about the wedding arrangements in that precise, toneless way she had, as though they were negotiating the terms of a contract rather than planning a marriage. He thought about the estate, the debts, the 8 months Harwick had given him, now considerably shortened. He thought about a woman in a black mask who lost hands deliberately, and watched him across a card table with eyes that felt somehow like a question he could not answer. And then, though he did not mean to, though he had trained himself rigorously not to, he thought about Vivienne. Vivienne Castellan, who had loved him without performance or pretense, who had laughed at things that were actually funny and said what she meant and looked at him sometimes as though she could see straight through every carefully constructed layer of duke and duty and expectation to whatever was underneath. He had let Harwick convince him that what was underneath was not enough. He had written the letter. He had ended it. He did not know what had happened to her after. He told himself it was better not to know. He told himself that. He had been telling himself that for 3 years. The following Thursday, he arrived at the Ivory Room earlier than usual. The widow was already there. She was always already there. He crossed the room, sat down across from her, and looked at her for a moment in the candlelight, the dark silk mask, the black dress, the gloved hands folded with that particular stillness on the green baize. You never told me, he said, what you are playing for. She looked at him with those eyes he could not read. Everyone is playing for something, he said. The money is never really the point. What is yours? The widow was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was so composed it gave nothing away at all. Justice, she said, and she cut the deck. November deepened into something gray and relentless over London. The fog came in off the river each evening and settled between the buildings like something that intended to stay, and the gas lamps along St. James's Street burned with a blurred, watery light that made the city feel like a place half remembered rather than actually lived in. Richard noticed none of it. He was thinking about justice. He had turned the word over in his mind for an entire week, through 2 dinners with Lady Sophia, through a tedious afternoon with his solicitor, through a breakfast with his younger sister Charlotte that he could only partially remember because half of his attention had been somewhere else entirely. Justice. Not revenge, not money, not the vague, comfortable answers most people gave when asked what they wanted: security, respectability, a good match. Justice. It was the answer of someone who had been wronged, specifically, deliberately, and seriously wronged. And it was the answer of someone who intended to correct that wrong herself, without waiting for the world to do it for her. Richard found he could not stop thinking about it. He found he could not stop thinking about her, which was, though he did not yet understand this, precisely what she had intended. He arrived at the Ivory Room on Thursday to find the widow already mid-game with 2 other gentlemen at the corner table. He stood at the edge of the room and watched. He had not done that before, watched her play someone else. He had always gone directly to the table, taken his usual chair, assumed his usual position in what he had begun to think of, without examining the presumption too carefully as their game. Watching from a distance was different. From a distance, he could see things the intimacy of the table had hidden from him. The way she managed the other two players, not just the cards but them. A fractional relaxation of her posture when one of them was bluffing. A barely perceptible pause before she played a particular card, time to land at exactly the moment the other player's confidence was at its highest. She was not simply playing cards. She was conducting. The game ended. Both gentlemen lost. One of them laughed about it with the rueful good grace of a man who could afford to, and the other left the table with the tight jaw of someone who could not. The widow gathered her winnings with quiet efficiency, and then she looked up across the room directly at Richard. She had known he was there the whole time. Of course she had. He walked to the table and sat down. "You were watching," she said, not an accusation, a simple statement of fact. "I was," he said. "You are not playing cards." She tilted her head slightly. "What am I doing?" "Reading people," he said. "The cards are almost secondary. You already know what someone is going to do before they do it." Something moved behind her eyes. Not the brief controlled flicker he had caught before, something slower. Something that might, in another light, have looked almost like pain. "Not always," she said quietly. She said it as though it meant something specific. He filed it away. That evening they played for 3 hours. It was the longest they had ever played, and it was different from the others in a way Richard could feel but not quite name. A shift in the temperature of the thing, a new quality to the silences between hands. As though some unspoken negotiation was occurring alongside the cards, conducted in a language neither of them was acknowledging out loud. She told him nothing about herself. She never did. But she asked him questions, small ones, careful ones, the kind that seemed like conversation but landed somewhere deeper. "Do you enjoy your life, Your Grace?" she asked, during a pause between hands when the dealer had stepped away. Richard looked at her. "That is an unusual question." "Most questions worth asking are." He considered it honestly, which surprised him. He was not in the habit of considering that particular question honestly. "I enjoy parts of it," he said finally. "The parts I chose." "And the parts you did not choose." "One manages," he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice had that quality again, that weight beneath the surface. "One does." "You speak as though you know something about managing things you did not choose," Richard said. She picked up her cards as the dealer returned. "Everyone does," she said. "Some of us simply become better at it than others." It was Charlotte who noticed first. His sister arrived at his townhouse on a Wednesday afternoon without sending word ahead, which was entirely characteristic of Charlotte, who operated on the principle that announced visits were for people who had something to hide. She was 24, sharp-minded, and constitutionally incapable of pretending not to see things. She sat across from Richard in the drawing room, accepted a cup of tea, and looked at him with the particular expression she had been perfecting since childhood. The one that meant she already knew the answer and was simply waiting for him to supply it. "You look different," she said. "I look exactly the same," Richard said. "You look like someone who is thinking about something they are not supposed to be thinking about." She paused. "Is it the wedding?" "The wedding is perfectly in hand." "Is it Lady Sophia?" "Lady Sophia is," he stopped. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Lady Sophia is a perfectly suitable match," Richard said, with the precise, careful diction of a man reciting something he has memorized. Charlotte set down her teacup. "Richard," she said, "who is she?" He looked at his sister for a long moment. "I do not know what you mean," he said. "You have the same expression you used to have when you were seeing Vivienne," Charlotte said, with the directness that had always been both her greatest quality and her most inconvenient one. That particular look of a man who is trying very hard not to look like a man who is thinking about a woman. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Richard said nothing. Charlotte watched him. "I think about her sometimes," Charlotte said more gently. "Vivienne, I always liked her. I never quite understood." She stopped herself. "It does not matter now. I simply want you to be careful, Richard. Whatever is distracting you, be careful." She left shortly after. Richard sat in the empty drawing room for a long time. He thought about what Charlotte had said. He thought about the widow and her precise, careful questions and the weight she carried beneath every word. And he thought for the first time, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the eyes behind that mask were familiar. Not familiar in the vague, uncertain way of a half-remembered face. Familiar the way a voice is familiar when you hear it in a dream, when some part of you knows it completely, even as the waking mind refuses to accept what that recognition means. He told himself he was wrong. He told himself he was exhausted and distracted and reading meaning into coincidence. He went to bed. He did not sleep. Vivienne, at that precise moment, was sitting at the writing desk in her rented rooms on Clarges Street, reading a letter she had received that afternoon. It was from her solicitor. The letter contained information she had spent 8 months and a considerable sum of money obtaining, and it was, at last, everything she needed. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the desk, as though it were fragile, though it was not fragile at all. It was, in fact, the most solid thing she had held in 3 years. She thought about the evening she had received Richard's letter ending their engagement. She had been at home in her father's house in Bath, sitting in the morning room where the light came in through the east-facing windows, and her father had taught her to play chess when she was 7 years old. She had read the letter standing up because she had not expected anything significant and had not bothered to sit down first. She had read it 3 times, because the first 2 times she could not make it mean what it said. Then she had sat down on the floor, because there was no chair immediately available, and her legs had made their own decision. Her father had found her there 20 minutes later. He had not said anything. He had simply sat down on the floor beside her, which was a remarkable thing for a man of 61 with a troublesome knee to do, and they had stayed there together until she was ready to stand up again. He had died 14 months later. The scandal of the broken engagement had cost him 2 business partnerships and a great deal of the social standing he had spent 30 years carefully building. The doctor said it was his heart. Vivienne knew what it was. She looked at the letter on her desk. She thought about Richard's face across the card table, the way he watched her, the way he had said justice back to her as though he were trying to understand the shape of the word. She thought about how easy it would be now to simply play the final card. She thought about how 3 weeks ago she had been entirely certain she wanted to. She was less certain now. That was the problem. She had not planned for the possibility that watching him across a card table for 5 weeks would remind her, with a vividness she found genuinely inconvenient, of why she had loved him in the first place. She had not planned for the conversations, the questions he asked that were too good, the way he had looked at her in the candlelight and said you are not playing cards with an accuracy that had gone straight through her like something cold. She had planned for a man she could destroy without feeling it. She had not planned for him to still be, underneath everything, the man she remembered. She picked up the letter again. It did not change what Harwick had done. It did not change what Richard had allowed. It did not change her father or the morning room in Bath or the floor, but it changed something. She was not yet sure what. The following Thursday, Richard sat down across from her and said, without any preamble at all, "I want to know your name." The widow looked at him. "That is not how this works," she said. "I am aware of how it works," Richard said. "I am asking anyway." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The candlelight moved between them. Because I think, he said carefully, that I have been a fool about a great many things, and I think you know more about that than you are telling me. The widow said nothing. I think, Richard said more quietly, that you came here for a reason that has nothing to do with cards, and I think, he started again. I think whoever wronged you did not deserve you, and I think they have no idea what they lost. The silence between them stretched long enough to become something else entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice was perfectly composed. "Play your hand, Your Grace," she said. But her hands, for the first time in 5 weeks, were not entirely still. It was Harwick who interrupted everything. He appeared at Richard's townhouse on a Friday morning, unannounced, with the tight, controlled energy of a man who has received news he does not like. He did not sit down. "The widow," he said, "you need to stop going to that table." Richard looked at him steadily. "Good morning, Harwick." "I am serious, Richard. Walk away from that table." "You were the one who brought me to that club." "I brought you there to solve a financial problem," Harwick said, "not to become obsessed with a woman no one can identify." He paused. "I have been making inquiries." Richard went very still. "And," he said, Harwick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know who she is," he said. The room was very quiet. "Then tell me," Richard said. Harwick looked at him for a long moment. That same calculating look Richard had noticed before, the one that sat just slightly outside the territory of genuine concern. "Walk away from the table first," Harwick said. "Then we will talk." He left before Richard could respond. Richard stood in the center of his study for a long time after the door closed. Harwick knew, and Harwick did not want him to know. Which meant, Richard understood with a cold and sudden clarity, that whoever the widow was, it was someone whose identity would change everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered not to Richard's townhouse but to the ivory room itself, left with the doorman in a plain envelope with no sender's name, only Richard's title written across the front in handwriting he did not recognize. The note inside was 4 lines long. "Thursday evening, the corner table. Bring everything you have left. One final game. Winner takes all. H." Richard read it standing in the entrance hall of the club, the doorman waiting at a respectful distance, the gas lamps hissing softly overhead. He should have felt afraid. Instead he felt, with a strange and unsettling clarity, that everything that had been building for the past 6 weeks had been leading precisely here. That the game had never really been about the cards. That whatever was coming on Thursday evening was the thing that had always been coming, from the moment he first sat down across from a woman in a black mask and felt that inexplicable pull of recognition. He folded the note. He put it in his pocket. He went home and did not sleep. He did not tell Harwick about the letter. He was not sure, by that point, how much he was willing to tell Harwick about anything. The realization had arrived gradually, the way most important realizations do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of small things that suddenly, all at once, added up to something he could no longer ignore. The way Harwick had looked when he said, "I know who she is." The way he had said, "Walk away from the table first," as though Richard's ignorance were a condition to be maintained rather than a problem to be solved. The way, now that Richard was paying attention, every piece of Harwick's advice over the past 3 years had served Harwick's interests as neatly as it had served Richard's own, sometimes more neatly. He thought about the engagement to Lady Sophia. Harwick had identified her, approached her father, structured the entire arrangement before Richard had met the woman once. At the time, Richard had been grateful for the efficiency. Now, turning it over in his mind with new and uncomfortable attention, he found himself wondering what, exactly, Harwick gained from that particular marriage. He thought about the debts. He had inherited them from his father, yes, but Harwick had managed his father's finances too. Had those debts always been as large as Harwick said? Had they grown somehow in the management? He thought about Vivienne. He thought about the letter he had written, the arguments Harwick had made. She is not suitable. The blood is wrong. Trade money does not become old money simply by accumulating. You will be laughed out of every room that matters. He had believed every word. He had wanted to believe it, perhaps. It had been easier to believe it than to hold the weight of what he was choosing to give up. But Harwick had built that ease deliberately, brick by careful brick. Richard sat in his study on Wednesday night with a glass of brandy he was not drinking and thought about all the ways a man could be managed without ever knowing he was being managed. And then he thought about a woman who had said justice across a card table and meant it. Thursday arrived the way significant evenings always do, looking, on the outside, entirely ordinary. The fog was back. The gas lamps made their blurred halos along the street. Richard dressed without particular care, told his valet he would not need the carriage, and walked to St. James's Street alone. The ivory room was busier than usual. He noticed it the moment he stepped inside, more men than a typical Thursday, and a particular quality to the atmosphere, a heightened attention, as though the room itself knew something was coming. Conversations were slightly too quiet. Eyes moved toward the corner table and away again with studied casualness. The corner table had been cleared of its usual occupants. The widow was already there, and Harwick was standing at the edge of the room, watching. Richard crossed to the table. He sat down. The widow looked at him across the green baize, and for a moment neither of them spoke. In the candlelight behind the black mask, her eyes were very still. "You sent the letter," Richard said quietly. "Yes," she said. "Harwick is here." "I know," she said. "He was always going to be here. That is rather the point." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to ask you something." She waited. "Do I know you?" he said, not as a challenge, not with the confidence of a man who has worked something out, with the voice of someone standing at the edge of something enormous looking down. The widow was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Play the game, Your Grace," she said. "You will have your answer before the evening is over." The game began. From the outside it looked, to the men watching from around the room, like exactly what it was, a high-stakes card game between 2 skilled players, the kind that the Ivory Room occasionally hosted and that members discussed for months afterward. From the inside it was something else entirely. Richard played well, better than he had played in weeks, in fact, with a cold, focused precision that came from having nothing left to protect. He was not playing to manage. He was not playing to survive. He was playing because something in the room demanded he be fully present for whatever was about to happen, and he was, at last, entirely present. The widow matched him. Hand after hand, they were almost exactly even, and Richard, who had spent 6 weeks learning to read her, began to understand that she was not letting him win this time. She was genuinely playing. Full force, no concealment, no careful management of his confidence. She was playing him as an equal. He found, absurdly, that this moved him more than anything that had happened in the past 6 weeks. They were an hour in when Richard noticed the dealer. It was a small thing. A fraction of a second, the man's wrist moving at a slightly wrong angle as he cut the deck. The kind of tell that would be invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. Richard was watching for it. He said nothing. He played the hand. He noted which cards the dealer had controlled and in which direction. He played the next hand and the next, building a picture in his mind of what was being arranged and for whom. By the third manipulated deal, he understood. The cards were being run against the widow, not against him, against her. Harwick, from his position at the edge of the room, was not simply watching. He was orchestrating. The dealer was his man. The game had been designed to look like a fair contest while systematically redirecting the widow's best hands away from her, not obviously enough to be detected by a casual observer, but consistently enough that over the course of a long evening, It would dismantle her entirely. Richard laid down his cards after the fourth manipulated hand. He looked across the table at the widow. She was looking back at him, and he understood from the particular quality of her stillness that she had seen it too. They looked at each other across the candle-lit table, and something passed between them without words, a question from him, an answer from her, a decision made in the space of 3 seconds that neither of them spoke aloud. Richard turned in his chair. "Harwick," he said. The room went very quiet. Harwick stiffened almost imperceptibly at the edge of the crowd. "Richard, this is not the moment." "Come here," Richard said, quietly, pleasantly, in the tone he used when he intended to be absolutely obeyed. Harwick came forward. He had no choice. Every eye in the room was on him. "The dealer," Richard said when Harwick reached the table. "He is yours." It was not a question. Harwick's expression did not change. He was a man who had spent decades ensuring his expressions never changed at inconvenient moments. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Richard said. He turned to the room. "I think several people here do." He looked back at Harwick. "I have been watching the cut for the past 4 hands, so I suspect has every other serious card player in this room." A murmur moved through the crowd. The dealer, to his credit, held very still, but his wrist moved, a single involuntary gesture toward his jacket pocket, and 3 men standing nearby all looked at that pocket at exactly the same moment. "Richard," Harwick said, with the measured control of a man who is recalculating very fast, "you are making an error." "I have been making errors for quite some time," Richard said pleasantly. "This is not one of them." He looked across the table at the widow. She reached up. The room held its breath. She took off the mask. The silence that followed was the kind that Richard had never experienced before and suspected he would never experience again. A silence with actual weight, actual texture, that pressed against his ears and his chest and the back of his throat. He looked at her face. He had known. Since Wednesday night, sitting in his study with the untouched brandy, he had known in the way that the body knows things before the mind is ready to accept them. He had known from Justice. He had known from the shape of her stillness and the weight beneath her words and the eyes that had looked at him across a card table as though they were finishing a conversation begun somewhere else entirely. He had known. Knowing had not prepared him. "Vivienne," he said. Her name in his mouth after 3 years of not saying it, she looked at him steadily. No performance, no triumph, no tears. Just Vivienne. Older by 3 years and 3 years' worth of things he had caused, looking at him across a card table in a room full of people who were absolutely silent. "Hello, Richard," she said. Then she turned to Harwick, and her voice when she spoke to him was an entirely different thing. "Lord Harwick," she said, "shall we discuss the letters?" Harwick's composure, which had survived Richard's accusations with impressive steadiness, developed its first visible crack. "I don't." "The letters you wrote to my father's business partners," Vivienne said, "in November of 1844, informing them falsely that my father's firm was under investigation for fraud." She paused. "The letters you wrote under a borrowed name, using information about my father's accounts that you could only have obtained through your position as the Duke of Asheville's financial advisor." The crack in Harwick's composure widened. "I have copies," Vivienne said simply. "I have had copies for some time. I was simply waiting for the correct room." She looked around the ivory room with its hushed, attending crowd, men of business, men of title, men who controlled things, all of them listening. "I believe," she said, "this is the correct room." What followed was not dramatic precisely. It was something quieter than drama and more devastating. Vivienne laid out what she had, not with anger, not with the heat of someone who has been waiting for revenge, but with the calm, methodical precision of someone who has spent 3 years becoming completely, unassailably prepared. The letters, the dates, the names of the business partners who had received them and the partnerships that had subsequently collapsed. The paper trail that connected those collapses to debts that had been quietly purchased by a holding company that, when its ownership was traced to its origin, led back to Edmund Harwick. He had not simply advised the Pemberton family. He had been systematically positioning himself to own them. The broken engagement had been part of it. A Castellan alliance would have brought outside scrutiny to the Pemberton finances, the kind of scrutiny that might have found Harwick's arrangements. The Sophia Grenville match had been part of it. Grenville's railway money would have cleared the debts Harwick had helped inflate, and the terms of the marriage settlement, Richard now understood, would have given Harwick control of the resulting consolidated estate. Richard had been managed for years by a man who had needed him grateful and financially desperate, and without anyone beside him who might ask the wrong questions. Vivienne had been removed because she was exactly the kind of person who would have asked the wrong questions. Richard listened to all of it. He did not look at Harwick. He looked at Vivienne. He looked at her and thought about a letter he had written 3 years ago and a floor in Bath and a father who had died of something that was not, in the end, his heart. He thought about all the ways a man could be complicit in a thing without pulling the trigger himself. He thought, I let it happen. I wanted an excuse and he gave me one and I let it happen. The thought sat in him like something iron. Harwick left the ivory room that evening between two men who were not, technically, constables, but who had the solid, purposeful manner of people who intended to ensure he arrived somewhere specific and did not detour on the way. Several of the men present had heard enough to make certain phone calls and write certain letters of their own before morning. The room emptied gradually. Richard did not move. Vivienne was gathering her things at the corner table, her mask, her gloves, the small bag she had carried every Thursday for 6 weeks, methodical, unhurried, as though the evening had gone exactly as she had planned, which it had mostly, except for the parts that had not. Vivienne, Richard said. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing first, which he suspected was not an accident. Then she looked at him. The debts, he said, Harwick's arrangements, the inflated figures. He stopped, started again. How much of what I believed was real? Enough, she said. You were in difficulty, less than you were told, but enough. He nodded. He had expected that. Your father, he said, I am. Do not, she said quietly, not harshly, but with a finality that stopped him completely. She picked up her bag. You should speak to your solicitor tomorrow, she said. The real figures are in the documents I have given to Mr. Ansley. She named a solicitor Richard did not recognize. You are not ruined, Richard. You never quite were. You simply needed someone to tell you the truth. She said it without bitterness. That somehow was worse than bitterness would have been. She turned to leave. Vivienne. His voice came out differently than he intended, lower and with less control. Please. She stopped. She did not turn around. I know, he said to her back, to the black dress and the straight spine and 3 years of silence between them, that there is nothing I can say tonight that should matter to you. I know that. I'm not asking you to. He stopped. His voice, for the first time in the evening, was not entirely steady. I just need you to know that I understand. What I did. What I allowed. I understand it now, and I am not going to insult you by asking you to absolve me of it in a card room. A long pause. Good, Vivienne said quietly. That is the first sensible thing you have said all evening. And she walked out. Richard stood in the empty corner of the ivory room in the guttering candlelight and felt the full weight of every choice he had made and failed to make settle onto him all at once. It was, he thought, exactly what he deserved. It was also, he thought, and this was new and strange, and he held it carefully, a beginning, if she would allow it. He did not know yet if she would. The morning after the ivory room, London talked. It always talked, of course. London was a city that ran on information the way other cities ran on water, constantly, necessarily, and with complete disregard for the damage it caused along the way. But this particular morning it talked with unusual focus and an almost architectural precision, because what had happened at the Ivory Room the previous Thursday had involved enough titled names, and enough money, and enough genuine scandal to keep every drawing room in Mayfair occupied for a considerable time. Edmund Harwick was the name on everyone's lips. By Friday afternoon, 3 separate accounts of the evening had circulated through the better clubs. By Saturday morning, 2 of Harwick's business associates had quietly and publicly distanced themselves. By Sunday, a solicitor representing 4 separate families had filed documents with a city magistrate, and the name Harwick had acquired the particular social quality of something one mentioned carefully, if at all. Richard knew all of this because Charlotte told him. She arrived at his townhouse on Saturday morning, again without announcing herself, and sat across from him in the drawing room with a cup of tea. She actually drank this time, and an expression that was doing a great deal of complicated work simultaneously. "So," she said. "So," Richard said. "Harwick." "Yes." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "How much did you know before Thursday?" "I suspected," Richard said. "I did not know. There is a difference, and I am not certain it is as large a difference as I would like it to be." Charlotte nodded slowly. She looked at her tea. She looked back at him. "And Vivienne," she said. Richard said nothing. "It was her," Charlotte said, "not a question." "Yes." Charlotte set down her teacup very precisely on its saucer. "She saved you," Charlotte said. "Yes." "After what you did to her." "Yes," Richard said, and his voice on that word was a particular kind of quiet that Charlotte had never heard from him before, not the controlled quiet of a man managing his composure, but something stripped of management entirely. Charlotte looked at her brother for a long moment. "Where is she?" she said. "I don't know," Richard said. "She left Thursday night, and I do not know where she is staying." "Have you tried to find out?" "I am trying," he said, "to give her the courtesy of not being hunted." Charlotte considered this. "That is thoughtful," she said. "It is also, if I may say so, completely unlike you." She paused. "You are in love with her." Richard looked at the window. "I never stopped," he said. "The man who found Vivienne's address was not a private inquiry agent. He was Richard's own solicitor, Mr. Gerald Foss, who had been managing the Pemberton legal affairs for 11 years with the loyalty of a man who took his professional obligations seriously, and the shrewdness of a man who had learned, over 11 years, to occasionally know things his employer had not specifically asked him to find out. Foss arrived at Richard's townhouse on Monday morning with a leather folder, a carefully neutral expression, and the information that a Miss Vivienne Castellan was currently residing in rented rooms on Clarges Street, and had been doing so for approximately 3 months. He also arrived with the documents from Mr. Ansley's office, Vivienne's documents, the one she had mentioned as she was leaving. Richard sat with those documents for 4 hours. What they contained was, by turns, meticulous and devastating. 3 years of work. Not just the evidence against Harwick, though that was comprehensive enough to make Richard's solicitor go very still when he read it, but a complete reconstruction of the Pemberton finances as they actually stood, stripped of Harwick's inflations and manipulations, with a clear accounting of what had been real debt and what had been manufactured pressure. The real debt was significant. Richard was not going to pretend otherwise, but it was manageable. It had always been manageable without the emergency of a calculated marriage to a woman he did not love. He thought about Lady Sophia. He had called on her father on Friday morning, before Charlotte's visit, before the documents, with only Thursday night behind him, and a decision that had crystallized somewhere between the widow walking out of the Ivory Room and Richard standing in the guttering candlelight, understanding what he had lost and what he had been. Lord Grenville had been cold about it. Richard did not blame him. The settlements were unwound with the particular legal chill of a negotiation conducted entirely without warmth, and Richard had left Grenville House knowing that particular door was closed permanently and that he had deserved every degree of the temperature. He did not regret it. He sat with Vivienne's documents and the address on Clarges Street and thought about what a man did when he had been comprehensively wrong and comprehensively saved by the person he had wronged, and what he possibly had the right to ask for after that. He thought about it for 4 hours. Then he put on his coat and went to Clarges Street. Vivienne opened the door herself, which surprised him briefly, and then did not surprise him at all, because of course she did not keep a full staff in rented rooms, and of course she would answer her own door, and of course she would do it without any of the performance or flutter that other women might have employed upon finding a duke on their doorstep. She simply opened the door and looked at him. She was wearing dark blue, not black, for the first time in 6 weeks, and her hair was done simply, and she had no mask and no gloves and nothing between her face and the November afternoon light. She looked, Richard thought, exactly like herself. He had forgotten, somehow, in 3 years of not allowing himself to remember, how entirely like herself she always looked. "Your Grace," she said, with a formality that was not quite cold but was several degrees below warm. "Miss Castellan," he said, "I would like to speak with you if you are willing. I will not stay long. I have no intention of, I am not here to press any claim or ask for anything you are not prepared to give." He paused. "I am here because I owe you a conversation I should have had 3 years ago, and I would like to have it if you will allow me." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. The sitting room was small and very tidy, and entirely without the decorative excess that characterized most rooms in most houses Richard entered. There were books on the side table, real books, with broken spines, actually read. There were papers on the writing desk organized in a way that suggested active, ongoing work. There was a single vase of late autumn flowers on the windowsill, already slightly past their best, kept because she liked them rather than because they were presentable. Richard recognized all of it: the tidiness, the books, the refusal to keep things past their usefulness except when she simply wanted to. He sat in the chair she indicated. She sat across from him, hands folded, spine straight, and waited. He had prepared on the walk from his townhouse what he intended to say. He had organized it carefully, acknowledgement first, then explanation, then the part where he made clear that he was not asking for forgiveness because forgiveness was not something that could be asked for, only given, and he had no right to solicit it. He opened his mouth. What came out was, "I am sorry about your father," not what he had planned to say first. But Vivienne's expression, which had been composed and waiting, shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, and he understood that it was the right thing to have said first. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not know," Richard said. I did not know until Thursday what Harwick had done, the letters to his partners. I want you to understand that I did not know that." "I know you didn't," Vivienne said. "But he stopped, began again. "I wrote the letter, Vivienne. Harwick gave me the arguments and I used them, but the letter was mine. I chose to write it. I chose to believe what was convenient to believe because it was easier than holding onto what I actually—" He stopped again. The room was very quiet. "What you actually what?" Vivienne said. Richard looked at her across the small sitting room. "What I actually felt," he said. "What I actually knew, which was that you were the most honest person I had ever met, and that frightened me considerably because I was not, at that point, a particularly honest person myself." Vivienne said nothing. "I was a coward," Richard said. "I was a coward, and Harwick was convenient, and I have spent 3 years telling myself that I made the sensible choice, and the truth is that there was no choice. I simply did not have the courage to hold on to the thing I wanted most." Silence. "You wanted most," Vivienne repeated very carefully. "Yes," Richard said. She looked at him for a long time. "Richard," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without his title since she had taken off the mask. "I came to London to ruin you." "I know," he said. "I spent 3 years planning it." "I know that too." "I am not," she paused. "I am not the same person I was when you knew me. What I did in that room on Thursday, that is who I am now. I am not the girl from Bath who thought love was simple." "No," Richard said, "you are considerably more formidable, I noticed." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "You should go," she said. "I know," he said. He did not move immediately. "Can I ask you one thing?" She waited. "When you decided not to play the final card," he said, "when you decided to expose Harwick instead of simply taking everything from me, when did you decide that?" A long pause. "Wednesday," she said finally, "the night before." Richard nodded slowly. "What changed?" he said. Vivienne looked at the window, at the flowers that were past their best and kept anyway. "You said," she said very quietly, "whoever wronged you did not deserve you, and they have no idea what they lost." She paused. "You said it about yourself, without knowing you were saying it about yourself." The room was entirely silent. "Go home, Richard," Vivienne said. He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. "I will not come back unless you ask me to," he said. "I want you to know that. I am not going to pursue you or petition you or make myself a presence you have to manage. You have managed enough things because of me." He looked at her one last time. "But I want you to know," he said, "that I am here, whatever that is worth." He left. Vivienne sat in the small sitting room for a long time after the sound of his footsteps had faded on the stairs. She looked at her hands. She thought about Wednesday night and the letter and the decision she had made sitting at this very desk. Not to destroy him, not to forgive him, but to do something more complicated than either. To give him the truth and see what he did with it. She had not expected him to come to Clarges Street. She had not expected, if she was being honest with herself, and she had spent 3 years learning to be ferociously honest with herself. She had not expected to feel, when she opened the door and saw him standing in the November light, anything other than the cold satisfaction of a completed plan. She had expected wrong. She looked at the flowers on the windowsill. She thought about a floor in Bath, and her father sitting down beside her, and 3 years of becoming someone who could walk into a room and dismantle a man's empire with documents and composure. She thought about Richard's voice saying, "I never had the courage to hold on to the thing I wanted most." She thought about how much she had wanted, for 3 years, to be done with wanting things. She looked at the door he had walked out of. She was not. She understood with a clarity that was almost annoying done. 3 weeks passed. Richard did exactly what he had said he would do. He did not come back. He did not write. He did not send Charlotte, though Charlotte clearly wanted to be sent. He did not engineer coincidental encounters in the park or leave cards with her landlady, or do any of the things that men in his position typically did when they had decided they wanted something and were accustomed to obtaining it. He simply was not there. And his not being there was, Vivienne found, considerably louder than his presence had been. She went about her days. She met with Mr. Ansley about the legal proceedings against Harwick, which were progressing with a satisfying momentum. She had 2 letters from women whose families Harwick had damaged, thanking her, one of them written in handwriting so unsteady that Vivienne had to set it down and walk to the window for several minutes before she could finish reading it. She took long walks in the cold November afternoons. She read. She worked. She thought about Richard with an irritating frequency that she refused to dignify by calling it anything other than a residual preoccupation with an unresolved matter. On the 22nd day, Charlotte Pemberton appeared at her door. Vivienne opened it and looked at her. Charlotte looked back with the expression of someone who has rehearsed several opening lines and abandoned all of them. "He doesn't know I'm here," Charlotte said immediately. "He would be absolutely horrified. He made me promise approximately 4 times not to interfere. And yet, Vivienne said. And yet, Charlotte agreed. May I come in? I will not stay long and I will not say anything on his behalf. I have something to say entirely on my own behalf. Vivienne stepped back from the door. Charlotte sat in the same chair Richard had sat in 3 weeks earlier, and folded her hands in a way that reminded Vivienne, with a sudden and unexpected vividness, of the girl she had known before, Richard's younger sister, who had always been warmer than the family required, and more perceptive than was entirely comfortable. I missed you, Charlotte said simply. When you left, when it ended, I missed you and I was angry at him for a long time, and I didn't say so because one doesn't in our family. We don't say things, we manage things. She paused. I just wanted you to know that someone missed you, that it wasn't only, she stopped, that you were not simply removed from his life. You were removed from mine as well, and I would like, if you are willing, to be your friend again, regardless of anything else. Entirely separately from anything else. Vivienne looked at Charlotte Pemberton, who had sat down on a floor in a house in Bath, metaphorically speaking, alongside her father. She felt something loosen in her chest. Something she had not known was still clenched. I would like that, Vivienne said. Charlotte smiled. It was a very good smile, genuine and slightly crooked and entirely without performance. Excellent, she said. Now, tell me absolutely nothing about my brother and let us have some tea. It was Charlotte, entirely without meaning to, who broke the dam. They had been having tea for 40 minutes, talking about everything except Richard, with the focused determination of 2 women who had agreed on a subject and intended to honor that agreement, when Charlotte reached for the teapot and said, entirely conversationally, "He gave the Wiltshire estate accounts to an independent firm last week, you know. Not Harwick's people. Entirely new. He is rebuilding the whole financial structure from the ground up." She refilled her cup. He also, she said, still conversationally, turned down a very advantageous introduction that Lord Fentworth made last Tuesday. A widow, considerable fortune. He said, Charlotte paused as though remembering. He said he was not currently in a position to consider introductions. She set the teapot down. I thought that was interesting, she said mildly. Vivienne looked at her. Charlotte looked back with the wide, innocent expression of a woman who was doing nothing whatsoever. Charlotte, Vivienne said. Well, you said you were not going to say anything on his behalf. I haven't, Charlotte said. I have simply reported some facts. Facts are entirely neutral. She sipped her tea. I will say one more neutral fact and then I will leave. She set down the cup. He is not the same as he was, Vivienne. I do not say this to excuse what he was. I say it because I have known him all my life and I have never seen him look at himself the way he has looked at himself these past weeks. It is not comfortable to watch. A pause. I think you did that. I think you gave him something he did not know he needed, which was a reason to be honest with himself. And I think that is a remarkable thing to have done for someone who did not deserve it. She stood up. She picked up her gloves. Thank you for the tea, she said. I am very glad you did not destroy him. And she left. Vivienne sat in the quiet sitting room. The tea was cooling. The flowers on the windowsill had been replaced. She had replaced them last week. She had noticed herself doing it. She had not examined why. She thought about 22 days of silence. She thought about a man who had sat in that chair and said, I am here, whatever that is worth, and then had been precisely where he had said he would be, available and entirely absent, in the specific way of someone who means what they say. She thought about 3 years of becoming someone who did not need anyone. She thought about whether not needing someone and not wanting them were the same thing. They were not. She had always known the same thing. She looked at the door. She sat with it for a long time. Then she went to the writing desk. She picked up a pen. She wrote 4 words. She sent the note before she could reconsider. Richard received it at 7 o'clock in the evening, brought in by his housekeeper with the particular expression of a woman who has read the return address and is attempting not to have an opinion about it. He opened it at his desk. 4 words, "Come for tea, tomorrow," no signature. She didn't need one. Richard sat at his desk for a moment. Then he did something his housekeeper, who had known him since he was 11 years old, had never once seen him do in all the years of his title, and his management and his careful, controlled composure. He laughed. Not politely, not briefly. A real laugh surprised out of him, full and unguarded, filling the study and going nowhere in particular. His housekeeper on the other side of the door allowed herself a very small smile. He arrived at precisely 4 o'clock. Not a minute early. That would have been too eager, and Richard had spent the walk from his townhouse to Clarges Street having a firm internal conversation with himself about the difference between sincerity and desperation. Not a minute late. That would have been a performance of casualness he did not feel and had decided, somewhere around the 3rd week of silence, he was finished performing. 4 o'clock exactly. Vivienne opened the door herself again. She was wearing green today, a deep, quiet green that Richard had never seen on her before, and that suited her in a way that made him understand. She had spent 3 years learning, among other things, exactly who she was and what she wanted to look like being it. "You are punctual," she said. "I am trying," he said, "to be many things I was not previously." She stepped back from the door. The sitting room was the same. The books, the papers, the flowers, fresh ones today, he noticed, white and very simple. She had made tea already. It was on the small table between the 2 chairs, and there was something almost domestic about it that Richard found he had to be careful not to look at directly, the way one is careful not to look directly at something very bright. He sat. She sat. She poured. For a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality from every other silence between them. Not the charged, strategic silence of the ivory room, not the careful silence of his visit 3 weeks ago. Something quieter, something that did not require filling. "How is the restructuring?" Vivienne asked. "Slow," Richard said. "Honest. Both of those things are new for me, as it turns out." "The honest part, perhaps," she said. "You were always capable of slow." He looked at her. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The same ghost he had seen 3 weeks ago, slightly more substantial this time. "The Harwick proceedings," he said. "Ansley's office sent me the latest filing. You built something very thorough." "I had time," Vivienne said, "and a considerable amount of motivation." 3 years of it. "Yes." Richard looked at his tea. "Can I ask you something I have no right to ask?" "You can ask," she said. "I will decide whether to answer." He looked at her. "Were you ever going to tell me, even if Thursday had gone differently, if Harwick's man had succeeded, if the game had gone the way he planned, were you ever going to tell me who you were?" Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "I told myself no," she said finally. "For a long time I told myself no. I was going to take everything, walk away, and never be in the same room as you again." She paused. "Then I sat across from you at that table and you said things that you were honest, genuinely, unguardedly honest in a way I had not expected. And it became—" She stopped. "Complicated," Richard said quietly. "Everything about you," Vivienne said, with a directness that was almost wry, "has always been complicated." "I know," he said. "I am sorry for that." "You should be," she said. But there was something different in it now, not absolution, nothing so clean as that, but something that had moved past the sharpest edge of what it had been. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the engagement or the letter or the specific architecture of what had gone wrong. They had said what needed to be said about those things, and both of them understood, without discussing it, that going over the same ground repeatedly was not the same as healing it. They talked about other things. The Wiltshire estate and what Richard actually intended to do with it, which turned out to be more considered than Vivienne had expected. The work Vivienne had been doing, not only the Harwick matter, but the correspondence she had been conducting with the other families, the quiet network of information and support she had been building for 3 years that had started as a mechanism for revenge and become, gradually, something more purposeful than that. Richard listened to her describe it with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely interested rather than politely attending, and Vivienne found herself saying more than she had intended to say because he kept asking the right questions in the right way, not to redirect or correct or impose a shape on what she was telling him, but simply because he wanted to understand. That had always been one of the things about him. She had forgotten, in 3 years of remembering only the letter, that it had always been one of the things about him. "You built something real," Richard said when she had finished. "What you did, the Harwick case, was the visible part, but the rest of it, what you built around it," he paused. "That is not what someone does who is only interested in revenge." "No," Vivienne said. "What is it then?" She looked at the window, at the white flowers, simple and deliberate. "I think," she said slowly, "that I spent the first year being angry, which was correct. The second year being strategic, which was necessary." She paused. "And somewhere in the third year I understood that destroying one man, however satisfying, was not enough. It was not enough to account for all the other women in rooms like mine who had no documents and no plan and no 3 years to prepare." She looked at him. "So I made it larger. I made it into something that could continue after Harwick." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You are going to need resources for that," he said. "I am aware," she said. "I would like to provide them," he said. "Not as I am not attempting to purchase anything with this. I want to be very clear about that. What you have built belongs to you, and I would not insult you by attempting to attach any conditions to the offer." He paused. "I simply have resources and you have built something worth resourcing, and those two facts seem relevant to each other." Vivienne looked at him. "That is a very careful offer," she said. "I am practicing careful," he said. "I noticed," she said, silence. "I will think about it," she said finally. "That is all I am asking," he said. He left at 6 o'clock. At the door he put on his coat and his hat and turned to her, and she saw him decide, visibly, not to say something, to hold it back, to leave with what had been accomplished today rather than reaching for more. She found she did not want him to hold it back. "Richard," she said. He looked at her. "What were you going to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I would like to come back," he said. "Not for tea necessarily, not for any specific reason, just," he stopped. "I would like, if you are willing, to be allowed back into your life in whatever form you decide is appropriate. And I would like you to know that whatever form that is, friendship or nothing more than the occasional correspondence about your work or something else entirely, I will take it and I will not ask for more than you give." Vivienne looked at him. She thought about the ivory room and 3 years and a floor and bath and 4 words on a piece of paper that she had sent before she could reconsider. She thought about how she had spent 3 years becoming someone who did not make decisions from fear, not fear of being hurt again, not fear of wanting something that might be taken away. She had become, she thought, someone who was allowed to want things. "Come on Thursday," she said. "Not for tea, for dinner. Charlotte as well if she would like to come." Something moved across Richard's face, not the controlled, managed expression she had watched across a card table for 6 weeks, but something unguarded and genuine and slightly undone. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes." He put on his hat. At the bottom of the steps he turned back once, and she was still in the doorway, and they looked at each other in the thin winter light of a late November afternoon in London. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They did not need to. Thursday came. Charlotte arrived 20 minutes early, which was characteristic, and spent those 20 minutes being comprehensively charmed by Vivienne's sitting room and saying so at length while Vivienne finished the arrangements with her hired cook in the kitchen. Richard arrived at exactly the right time. Dinner was simple. Vivienne had not attempted grandeur, which was correct, and Richard noticed this and appreciated it without saying so, which was also correct. They talked through 3 courses and passed them. Charlotte, freed from the restraint of her previous visit, was fully herself, quick and perceptive and funny in the slightly dangerous way of someone who sees everything and has decided life is too short to pretend otherwise. Richard was different at this table in this room than he had been anywhere Vivienne had observed him before, not performing the Duke, not managing, simply present. She had not seen him simply present since before. She found she liked it considerably. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, and Charlotte curled into the armchair with the ease of someone who has decided to be entirely at home, and Richard sat on the small settee and Vivienne sat at the other end of it, and the fire burned low and quiet. And they talked until the clock on the mantel said 10, and Charlotte announced she required her carriage. Richard walked his sister out and came back up the stairs and stood in the doorway of the sitting room. Vivienne was on the settee, turned slightly toward the fire, and she did not look like someone who had spent 3 years in cold, careful preparation. She looked like someone who had come through something very long and very difficult and was, at last, in a room that felt like rest. Richard looked at her. "I should go," he said. "You should," she agreed. He did not move immediately. "Vivienne," he said. "I know," she said quietly to the fire. "I am not going to rush this," he said. "I want you to know that. I know what I want and I am not going to pretend otherwise because pretending is what I have been doing for 3 years and I am done with it. But I am also not going to." "Richard," she said. He stopped. She turned from the fire and looked at him in the doorway. "I know," she said again. And this time it was not to the fire. It was to him directly, with the full clear gaze she had been using across card tables for 6 weeks, the one that gave nothing away and gave everything away simultaneously. He understood. "Good night, Vivienne," he said. "Good night, Richard," she said. He went down the stairs. She heard the front door close. She sat for a moment in the quiet room, in the low firelight, with the white flowers and the books and the papers and the life she had built out of the ruins of something that had nearly unmade her. She sat with it. She was smiling. She had not decided yet when she would tell him that, but she was, and it was real and it was hers. That, she thought, was enough for a Thursday evening in November. The weeks that followed moved differently from the weeks before. Not quickly, nothing between them was going to move quickly, and both of them understood this without discussing it, the way people who have been through serious things together understand the value of not rushing past them. But steadily, with the particular quality of something being built correctly, with attention to the foundation, rather than assembled in haste and hope to hold. Richard came for dinner on Thursdays. Sometimes Charlotte came. More often it was only the two of them. They talked about his estate and her work and books they had both read and opinions they disagreed on, which were numerous, and the disagreements were some of the best conversations Vivienne had had in years because Richard argued honestly now, not to win, not to manage, but because he actually thought what he said and wanted to know what she thought back. She told him in early December that she would accept the resources for her work, with conditions she had drawn up herself that made her solicitor nod approvingly, and made Richard read them with the expression of a man who is finding someone's precision extremely attractive. He accepted every condition without amendment. In mid-December, he took her to see the Wiltshire estate for the first time, Charlotte as chaperone, which Charlotte accepted with the expression of someone performing a duty she found largely ceremonial. The estate was beautiful in the winter light, frost on the grounds, the old stone of the house the color of something that had been there a very long time and intended to remain. Vivienne walked the grounds and Richard walked beside her and they talked about what it could be, not what it had been, not the weight of the 300 years, but what it could be going forward, with honesty about its difficulties and genuine thought about its possibilities. She saw, that afternoon, that he loved it. Not the title, the place itself, the specific fields and the specific trees, and the particular way the light came across the east lawn in the afternoon. He loved it the way one loves something that is genuinely one's own, and seeing it made her understand something about him that all the conversations over dinner had been building toward without arriving at. He was, underneath everything that had been put on top of him, a man who simply wanted to be honest about what he loved. He had not known how to do that. He had been learning. On the carriage ride back to London, Charlotte fell asleep against the window with the unbothered ease of someone who has decided her presence is sufficient chaperoning regardless of whether she is conscious. And Richard and Vivienne sat across from each other in the blue winter dusk and talked quietly for an hour. And at some point during that hour Richard's hand was on the seat between them. And at some point during that hour Vivienne's hand was beside it. And at some point during that hour they were no longer beside each other but simply together, fingers intertwined, neither of them marking the exact moment it had happened. Charlotte, who was not actually asleep, allowed herself a very small smile against the carriage window and said nothing whatsoever. Christmas came. It was not, in the end, a dramatic thing. There was no grand declaration in a ballroom, no public gesture designed to undo the public humiliation of 3 years ago. Vivienne had not wanted that, and Richard had understood without being told. What there was instead was a quiet Christmas Eve in Vivienne's sitting room, the two of them and Charlotte, and a small gathering of people Vivienne had collected over 3 years. The solicitor Ansley and his wife, 2 of the women who had written to her, a friend from Bath who had stayed loyal through everything. Richard sat in the middle of it, the only person present who had once been on the wrong side of everything, and was simply, quietly there. He handed things when asked and listened when spoken to, and did not attempt to be anything other than a man at a Christmas Eve gathering who was glad to be where he was. Vivienne, carrying something from the kitchen, passed the doorway of the sitting room and stopped for a moment to look at him in the firelight. He caught her looking. He did not look away. Neither did she. Later, after Charlotte and the others had gone, and the fire had burned to a comfortable low, and they were sitting on the settee with the remains of the evening around them, Richard turned to her. "I have something I want to say," he said. "I have been practicing it." Vivienne looked at him. "How long?" "Approximately 6 weeks," he said. "I kept revising it." "What happened to the previous versions?" "Too long," he said. "Too many words. I kept trying to explain and justify, and I kept trying to make a case, and then I understood that making a case is not what this is." "What is it?" she said. He looked at her. "I love you," he said. "I loved you when I was too much of a coward to hold on to it, and I have loved you through 3 years of not being allowed to say it, and I love you now. That is all. That is the whole of it. I am not asking you for anything tonight. I simply needed you to know." The fire shifted. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, for the 3rd time. But this time she was smiling fully, finally, without the ghost of it. "You are going to keep saying that," Richard said, "until I stop being surprised by it." "Yes," she said. "How long will that take?" She considered him. "Ask me in 50 years," she said. And this time when he laughed, she was laughing too. 14 months later, Scotland, February 1849, the church held 12 people. Vivienne had counted them herself that morning, standing in the small vestibule in her coat while the minister fussed with the candles, and had felt nothing but satisfaction at the number. 12 people who actually knew them. 12 people who had been present for the real story, not the version London would have preferred. She was wearing deep green. Her own choice, her own dressmaker, paid for with her own money. Richard had seen the dress the moment she appeared at the end of the aisle, and had done something she had never once seen him do in public. He had let his face show exactly what he felt. Every one of the 12 people in that church saw it. Charlotte, in the front row, pressed her lips together very firmly and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The ceremony was short. When Richard made his vows, his voice was steady. When Vivienne made hers, hers was steadier. This was not a competition. It was simply that she had decided, and once Vivienne decided something, there was no uncertainty left in her about it. Afterward, outside in the thin February light, Charlotte hugged her so tightly that Vivienne's carefully arranged hair became slightly less carefully arranged, and neither of them mentioned it. They walked back to the inn where the small wedding breakfast waited. Richard offered her his arm. She took it. After a moment he said, quietly, "Are you happy?" Vivienne considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The Scottish hills were pale gray and white in the February morning. The air was cold and clean and smelled of wood smoke from the village below. Beside her was a man who had been wrong and known it and done the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone who could be trusted with the knowledge. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but honestly. "Yes," she said, simply, without qualification. Richard exhaled, a long, quiet breath she understood had been held in some form for longer than 14 months. "Good," he said. They walked on. Behind them, Charlotte was telling the minister something that was making him laugh with apparent helplessness, and ahead of them the inn windows glowed warm against the gray morning, and the road was clear. They did not go back to London for 3 months. Nobody was surprised. Harwick was convicted the following spring. Vivienne was not in the courtroom. She was in Wiltshire, walking the East Lawn in the afternoon light, making notes in a small book about what the old gamekeeper's cottage might become with the right attention. Richard found her there at 4 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of tea he had made himself because the housekeeper had the afternoon off. He handed her one. She did not look up from her notes. "Thank you," she said. He sat down on the low stone wall beside her and looked at the fields. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them needed to. "Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories."